These terms, allegorical and literal, have to be carefully thought through to answer a question like this. When I look at literal, I have the understanding, as most readers would, I think, that we're talking about is Genesis history. And then the term allegorical, it's probably asked by people in the way that they mean, is this non-history? So we're pitting history against non-history when we're reading Genesis. Typically, when this kind of question is asked, it's addressing the opening chapters. So we're not primarily thinking about the Joseph story as much as we might be what's going on in Genesis 1 to 11. And I get the question here because there's a lot of stuff crammed into centuries and centuries of time in those opening 11 chapters. Once chapter 12 happens and the story of Abraham kicks off, the question is, have we now reached the historical stuff? And maybe non-history was preceding that. Well, the way I want to approach this question is to say, not only does the Old Testament, I think, insist that those first 11 chapters are historical, the later biblical authors in the New Testament confirm this as well. We are reading history because the living God is being proclaimed in Genesis 1 to 11 to have created all things from nothing, using no other created matter, no other competing gods. There's only the living God, and he makes all things. And among what he has created are image bearers. Now, he creates Adam in Genesis 2, and from Adam he makes Eve in Genesis 2 as well. And part of the discussion around these opening chapters are, well, is there a historical Adam? Was there a historical creation? When we look at genealogies in the Old Testament, this is an example of what I meant, that the Old Testament confirms the historicity. You have names. In Genesis 5, a series of names. You have names before you get to the end of Genesis, other genealogies along the way. The Jewish scriptures are trying to trace generations and descendants. Adam has Seth, and Seth has descendants that go all the way down to Noah. If we're willing to say that the opening chapters of Genesis are non-historical, I would simply want to ask somebody, well, when do the historical names actually begin? How many names down in the genealogy is there a genuine literal person we're actually dealing with? I think the genealogies in the Old Testament are an easy example to confirm that the later biblical authors are reading the opening chapters as God literally creating a man we know as Adam, the first image bearer, our first of the parents. Now, New Testament authors have the same kind of confirmation. In Romans chapter 5, Paul is giving an example, a contrast between Adam's disobedience and the Lord Jesus' righteousness and obedience. That kind of contrast works because the literal Jesus is an obedient last Adam, contrasting with the disobedient first Adam at the beginning of human history. Therefore, both the Old and the New Testaments are viewing that event, the creation of Adam, a historical figure, a true and real individual, as something real. And I think if we're going to grant credibility to the way the Old and New Testament authors read those early chapters of Genesis, we want to grant historicity as well. Now, there are complications in the opening chapters. No doubt, believers throughout the ages have disagreed in good fellowship with one another, sometimes not so good fellowship with one another, but not as a litmus test of salvation, about how to understand the act of creation, the days of creation. And I'm convinced that believers will continue to have discussions and hopefully good faith arguments on how to understand those issues. But the common denominator within those discussions is that there is a real creator who made a real place where a real image bearer was put named Adam. And the historicity of those things is a common denominator among some of the discussions about how to understand the finer points and arrangement of Genesis 1. So I'm convinced that Christians can continue good faith discussions about how to understand all the finer points and interpretations without having to deny the historicity of the opening chapters of Genesis. We have to remember that when Genesis is written, these Israelites receiving the books of Moses, which include the first book, Genesis, they are learning about this earlier history predating them by many centuries. And as the Israelites are receiving the books of Moses, they live themselves in a culture, a series of cultures, Egyptian and otherwise, as they travel to the land of Canaan, where many cultures are going to have their own competing worldviews and assumptions about where things came from, about why there's something rather than nothing. Genesis is something we should grant historical credibility to as it gives the true story of the world. over against the myths of the ancient Near East, which postulated all kinds of polytheistic explorations of things and creations of things, gods warring with other gods, committing acts of immorality and violence, even creating mankind because the gods had needs that needed to be met, and so they created man to meet those needs. When you read the Genesis account and you read the creation myths of the ancient Near East, there are some stark differences in a way that writers like John Currid and others who study ancient Near Eastern documents and Old Testament archaeology, they use the language polemic. That Genesis 1, in addition to beginning to tell the true story of the world, is actually subverting the competing rival ancient Near Eastern myths. As Christians, it's good to see this story in light of other competing narratives, because we can see here is the living God giving us the true story of the world and subverting those other myths and being able to separate truth from error. And we can believe wholeheartedly in the creation account. The living God making us for His glory, as He has made all things for His glory. We have a historical and not allegorical description.